I got this kit directly from the Radonseal website. As you can see, it was about $120. Okay, so this is the Radonseal DIY Foundation Crack and Repair Kit. Little tape stuck here. All right. If you open it up, we got stuff about the polyurethane injection foam, the instructions, and then it comes with the injection ports, some sticks to apply, gloves, the tube, the actual foam itself. And we got A and B compounds that we mix together, and we got the water injector to make sure everything in the crack is damp. Comes with goggles and a wire brush as well. All right, so here you can see my window well, and what I've done is I've cut and taped back the vapor barrier here that was installed with the house, and you can see the crack. And now up here, it's stayed relatively dry. So everything is dried out already, but you can see the crack as it goes down. It gets kind of narrow right around here, and it's really quite narrow towards the bottom. Let it focus a minute. There we go. And it goes right down that center line there. That is pretty narrow, and in fact, the water only comes out from about the vapor barrier area and down. So right around where this piece is right here, that's where most of the water comes through. And then it kind of just percolates through that crack and comes down here. So I'm going to try to get this sealed up before winter hits and more water gets in there and has a chance to expand and mess it up even more. At this point, if you can, it's a good idea to widen the crack. I didn't do it, and I should have done it. In the end, my method does work, but you'll see when I inject the foam that it gets a little bit messy. So at first I thought the price tag was a little high for this kit, but after seeing all the stuff that came with it, like this wire brush that I didn't have already, and the gloves and everything, it just makes it way easier. The wire brush works really well. Make sure you clean out the crack as best you can, get all the little debris out of there, and then I do use a vacuum to suck up the any dust that got in while I was brushing it out. Once the crack has been cleaned out, it's time to mix parts A and B for the epoxy and stick on the ports. Now my poured wall is textured, so it made it really difficult to make sure that everything was adhering to the crack and not letting any holes poke through or any air holes. So I had to apply quite a bit of epoxy. What I should have done was grind down the bumps a little bit more, make a smoother surface for the epoxy to adhere to, because as you'll see later, all those little holes are where the foam started spouting out. And I do apologize, but I forgot to change the camera angle here, so you're unable to see me stick the ports to the crack directly, but basically you just line it up so that when you look through the hole in the ports, you're able to still see the crack. I let the epoxy on the ports settle and harden for a little bit before I went on to the next step of applying more epoxy to cover the crack. Again, this would have been much easier if I had grinded down all those bumps and made it easier for everything to stick to. So you let that harden for a couple hours just to make sure it's completely cured. And then you take the water bottle and you start squirting water in there. So the foam has something to adhere to and expand with, but it also clears out the crack and it pushes all the extra little debris down towards the bottom and gets it out. So you can also tell if the ports, or if there's any holes in your epoxy, and water should be coming out of the ports. So when I pour this, you can see that there's water dripping down from under the ports, which means I have a hole in my epoxy. So I just go back over it with some more epoxy and try to cover up the hole. Once the epoxy patches have cured, it's time to start injecting the foam through the bottom port. So what they say is it should start coming out the port above it when it's time to move up. Well, it didn't really happen for me because there were still some holes in my epoxy. So you can see as I start injecting it, it just starts oozing through those holes. So what I did was, instead of trying to patch it up again because there's already foam in there, and by the time I were to patch it and it were to dry, that foam probably would have solidified anyhow. So I just went above it and started injecting more. In theory, what should happen then is that will just trickle down, the foam will trickle down and meet with the stuff that did make it in. Another good suggestion is don't push the foam in too hard. That's another mistake I did a couple times, or at least this first bottom one, I pushed it in too hard and that didn't allow it to go into the crack. So what I should have done was apply it a lot slower so it would find the crack and start working its way in. Also, again, try widening the crack. That will help it to get into the crack more easily and less likely to be forced out through tiny holes in your epoxy. Here's what it looked like shortly after I finished injecting all the foam. You can see there were a lot of spots where the foam started leaking out. As long as it's coming out of the ports when you are pushing it through the port above it, that's a good sign that it's connecting and meeting, at least in the crack. And you can see I did have to use some Flex Seal tape to patch a really big hole there that was oozing a lot. The Flex Seal actually did work. I had to apply some pressure with my hands as well, gloves on of course, but it did stop the foam from flowing. I let that harden and expand for about 2 days, and then I came back and I knocked off all of those little ports with a hammer and took off the duct tape and covered it right back up. I've had a few rains, some really heavy rains that usually would have had water coming in through that crack, and so far I'm dry as a bone. I'm not sure exactly what it looks like on the other side because I have a patio on the other side and there's no digging underneath that patio. I'm not about to tear that up. But so far it is working really well and I'm really happy with this product.